We may have just witnessed the defining moment in the Ukraine war. Amidst all of Putin's machinations and his attempts to divide NATO and stop Ukraine from receiving what it needs to defend itself, NATO just went and did something massive. A triple whammy of decisions has just put Ukraine on the cusp of victory. Putin now faces his biggest nightmare. He wanted to divide, but he has just created a more united NATO and a stronger Ukraine, all as every single one of his plans for 2026 dribbles down the drain. On July 7th, NATO's Ankara summit began. There has been a ton of speculation about what NATO would decide as its members met to unveil their latest plans for strengthening the defense alliance and ensuring that Ukraine would have what it needed to continue to fend off Russia. But this summit ended up being more than about fending off Putin. NATO's members delivered a triple whammy of decisions that have sent shockwaves rolling through the Kremlin, and nobody will be feeling the power of those shockwaves more than Vladimir Putin, who can do nothing but watch as the course of the Ukraine war has changed forever. We'll start with the most important move that NATO just made, delivering a massive aid commitment to Ukraine. The biggest news out of Ankara is that NATO's European members and Canada have combined to commit around $80 billion of military support to Ukraine in 2026. The move was rumored in the weeks running up to the summit, and NATO has delivered. But then it went bigger. NATO hasn't just pledged $80 billion for 2026. It has also said that it will maintain a comparable level of military assistance in 2027, which means Ukraine has walked out of Ankara with a 2-year pledge of military aid that adds up to a staggering $160 billion. And all of this is coming from 31 NATO members, notably with the US excluding itself. But there is a caveat: this isn't all new money. The Kyiv Post points out that the $160 billion commitment is linked to the $103 billion loan facility that the European Union or EU has set up to support Ukraine in 2026 and 27. Still, additional financing will be required, as existing programs don't cover the full figure, with the only barrier now being that NATO needs to decide how much each of its members will give to the massive aid contribution. Ukraine needed this, perhaps more than you know. A lot has been said about Russia's many financial troubles, all of which have been caused by Putin's insane war. Indeed, we've devoted several videos that cover how Russia is on the edge of a financial precipice. However, Ukraine is far from being in a great economic position itself. That should come as no surprise. Over 4 years of war would wear any nation down. In a March article, the BBC revealed the Ukraine government's budget for 2026 was $112 billion, with 60% of that money being dedicated to the war effort. Ukraine's big problem here was that the budget it created left it with a $45 billion shortfall. NATO's latest move covers that shortfall and then some, allowing Ukraine to focus more on its people and perhaps even build a small safety net that it can rely on if the war stretches into 2028 and beyond. In the same month that BBC published its report, Bloomberg said that Ukraine was at risk of running out of money by the end of June, with the potential of aid being withdrawn being one of the biggest risk factors. We now know that the well didn't run dry for Ukraine. Hungary's veto on the EU loan we mentioned earlier has disappeared now that Viktor Orban has been ousted, and Ukraine has a reprieve. More than a reprieve, in fact, it has a 2-year commitment for the billions of dollars it needs to fund its fight, as NATO has sent the clearest signal yet that it's supporting Ukraine for the long haul. Ukraine was on the edge of its own financial cliff. NATO just pulled back Ukraine from the brink. Russia is still on the edge, and there's no more help coming for Putin. We know where Putin's mind will be going from here. Russia needs to act fast to turn the tide of 2026, and the best way to do that is to unleash more missiles against Ukraine than ever before. But that brings us to the second whammy of the trio that Ankara delivered to Russia. The US is going to grant Ukraine a license to build its own Patriot missiles. When Ukraine's team headed to Ankara, its most urgent request was more air defense missiles. Specifically, Ukraine needed Patriot interceptors, a lot of them. Russia's ballistic missile threat is one of the key advantages that it holds over Ukraine, and a shortfall in Patriot interceptors is allowing Russia to do more damage than ever. Though some may wonder about the US commitment to Ukraine, given its lack of involvement in the funding announcement, the Trump administration has delivered precisely what Ukraine needs. The US isn't sending more Patriot missiles, it's giving Ukraine the much more valuable opportunity to build those missiles itself. During a joint press conference with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, US President Donald Trump said, "We're going to give them the right to make Patriots. We'll show them how to make them. This way you can't complain that we're not giving them enough. It's a make them yourself." Tinged with a minor insult though the statement may be, it will be music to Ukraine's collective ears. The US has only licensed the production of Patriot missiles to Germany and Japan in the past. Ukraine is going to be joining a very select list, but it's a list that Ukraine desperately needed to be a part of. Zelensky made that clear ahead of the Ankara summit as he labeled getting more air defense missiles as Ukraine's top priority. We are capable of doing everything else ourselves, but when it comes to air defenses, we need our partners' determination, Zelensky added. Though it didn't seem that Ukraine has walked away from Ankara with a pledge of more Patriot interceptor deliveries, this do-it-ourselves attitude can work in the country's favor. Ukraine has built an impressive defense industry since Putin launched his invasion. In 2026, that industry will have a projected production capacity of $55 billion, which is 55 times more than when Putin invaded. In other words, Ukraine has the facilities to build Patriot missiles. Now it has the permission, and according to Trump, it will be receiving guidance from the US so that it can get its manufacturing processes up and running as fast as possible. Why is this such a huge win for Ukraine? We only need to look at the missile and drone assault that Russia launched against Ukraine overnight on July 6th to get the answer to that question. During the attack, Ukraine failed to intercept any of the 23 Iskander-M missiles that Russia launched, Bloomberg reports. The outlet also points out that 6 Zircon and Onyx missiles also managed to breach Ukraine's air defenses. As Ukraine has run low on Patriot interceptors, its Iskander missile interception rate across 2026 has taken a dive. At the beginning of the year, Ukraine was intercepting around 80% of those missiles, but around mid-May, the interception rate cratered to below 40%. And barring a brief period when it went back above that percentage, the rate has only been getting lower since. If Ukraine can build its own Patriot interceptors, it can keep its air defenses stocked and make Russia's aerial assaults far less effective. However, as with the aid, there is a caveat here: time. Questions remain about how quickly Ukraine will be able to get itself into a position where it can build Patriot interceptors, never mind build them at a scale required to counter Russia's ballistic missile blitzes effectively. Trump believes that Ukraine will be able to master production relatively quickly once the US demonstrates how to do it. But based on past licensees, it may take quite a while. Japan required 2 years to get its Patriot production up and running, Defense Express points out. It's looking like Germany will start delivering its first Patriot missiles in 2027, and production on its intended production line was established in 2024. So this could be a multi-year project for Ukraine. However, neither of those licensees is under direct attack right now. Ukraine has more motivation than Japan or Germany to get production up and running, and it's shown a remarkable agility in taking its own precision weapons from ideation to mass production in a short amount of time. Still, it may take Ukraine years to really feel the benefits of this decision. Ukraine will need its NATO partners to step up and provide Patriot interceptors as it gets set up. Nevertheless, we see here a vital first step in Ukraine strengthening its air defenses against the Russian ballistic missile threat. And with that, we come to the third whammy that Ankara delivered to Russia. NATO made another massive move that integrates Ukraine deeper into the European security environment than ever before. But before we reveal what that move is, this is the military show. If you haven't subscribed yet, then now is the perfect time to hit the button and ring the notification bell so you always see what we have coming next. The final move that NATO made at Ankara was more about political signaling than providing support to Ukraine. But it was a signal that Putin never wanted to see. NATO has collectively declared that Ukraine is a security contributor to the Euro-Atlantic area. This seems like a minor thing on the surface. You could even argue that Ukraine has held this position for a long time, especially as it's building defense partnerships throughout Europe and has become the go-to nation for drone production. However, the words security contributor matter. Why? NATO is very particular about the language that it uses, and this particular term is typically only used when the organization is assessing whether a nation can become a NATO member. What we've just seen from NATO is the strongest suggestion yet that Ukraine is being considered for membership. This doesn't mean that Ukraine is on the fast track to membership. There is still plenty of opposition to Ukraine becoming a NATO member, especially as the war with Russia still rages. And that opposition makes sense. If Ukraine becomes a member now, Russia's invasion would inevitably lead to the triggering of Article 5, which would draw NATO's other members into the war that Putin started. Membership now is an escalation, and one that NATO can't risk because it could lead to Putin going off the deep end. Still, the use of this term is a strong signal delivered to Russia's leader. It's also a recognition of Zelensky's argument for Ukrainian membership in NATO, which he made ahead of the Ankara summit. Do you really believe it will be right to leave outside NATO a country and people with this level of defense capability? Zelensky questioned, adding, "If we already have these capabilities, if Ukrainians already know how to fight like this, then it does make sense for these capabilities to become part of the alliance's collective defense. That would make us all stronger." Zelensky has a point. There are more considerations than Ukraine's strength that need to be considered. NATO recognizes both sides of the argument, so we could see its labeling of Ukraine as a security contributor as a sign that Ukraine will be considered for NATO when the Ukraine war ends. And just as worryingly for Putin, it's also a signal that NATO believes that Ukraine is going to come out on top in that war, which would clear the path for its membership. What we are witnessing here is a true defining moment of the Ukraine war. NATO is delivering the strongest signals yet that it's going to support Ukraine for the long haul, and that matters for a simple reason. It's a slap in the face to Putin's strategy of dividing NATO so Russia can conquer Ukraine. Russia's president has made no secret of his strategy for NATO. Division is the goal. The more fractures he can create within NATO, the longer it takes the organization to make decisions, all of which affords Putin the time to do what he wants. As The Hill points out, creating this division is also seen by Putin as the only way that Russia can truly defeat NATO. In a conventional military sense, the full force of NATO would overcome Russia. A direct war, though possible, could mean the end for Russia. So it's better to try to bring about the end of NATO not through force, but by planting seeds of division. Support for Ukraine has long been one of those seeds. Attempted manipulation of the US since Trump came to power has been one of the Russian leader's tactics, and he would have been overjoyed to hear Trump condemning NATO over the last few years. That condemnation hasn't ended. During the same Ankara conference where Trump said the US would license Patriot missiles to Trump also called Spain a wasted cause and a terrible partner in NATO. That seems to have come as a result of Spain not allowing the US to use military bases on its territory for Operation Epic Fury. Still, it shows that there are opportunities for Putin to exploit within NATO. Putin is trying to set NATO up for a fall. There are now concerns that Russia is planning some sort of military action, perhaps in the Baltic region or Poland, and the division that Putin has tried to create would be key. What NATO has just done in Ankara, particularly regarding Ukraine and the support that it's receiving, is deliver a message to Putin. Division? What division? At least when it comes to Ukraine, NATO is providing precisely the sort of united front that Putin does not want to see. Sure, the US isn't contributing to the financial commitment, but it's made a big move with the Patriot licensing. And the implications that Ukraine could become a NATO member in the future are a killer for Putin's plans to divide NATO's members, the point where Ukraine is isolated. The best laid plans of Putin have gone awry. Important political signals have been sent by NATO, with the Patriot deal in particular, showing that Ukraine has earned enough respect within NATO to be treated as a key partner. After all, that deal isn't just about making missiles. It recognizes that Ukraine has the capacity to make those missiles in the first place, which simply wasn't the case before Putin invaded. Putin isn't happy about any of this, and if you need signs to show you that, you only need to look at the words being spoken by his Kremlin mouthpiece in the wake of Ankara. Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has already labeled the outcome of Ankara and the decisions that NATO has made as catastrophic and irresponsible. That's not a strong condemnation. It's Kremlin panic being given a voice. Of course, this is catastrophic for Russia. NATO has just handed Ukraine the keys to victory by ensuring that it will be funded for at least the next 2 years, on top of everything else. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has also delivered a scathing rebuke to Russian claims that NATO is decaying due to the internal debates that Russia's division tactics are creating. Rutte says that debate isn't a sign of weakness. Debate happens in functioning democracies, something that Putin wouldn't know anything about. But what has really scared Russia after Ankara is that it's seen a shift in NATO policy. At Ankara, NATO told Russia that it's no longer looking to manage a crisis in Ukraine. NATO is funding a Ukrainian victory that it believes has become inevitable as Russia's army falters and Putin leads his country further down the path of economic oblivion. This isn't about surviving anymore, it's about winning. NATO has turned what was once a crisis situation into an opportunity to end Russian aggression once and for all. None of this has gone according to Putin's plan. He saw US claims that it will scale back its defense presence in Europe as a positive. But instead, he got a commitment from NATO's European members, along with Canada, that they will all support Ukraine more strongly than before, and in the process will turn themselves into stronger opposition to Russia than they were before Putin invaded Ukraine. There's an element of Europe decoupling from the US in all of this. The debate could rage forever on whether this is good or bad, but the one thing that this decoupling means is that Europe, as a collective, needs to get stronger. The same Europe that is much more of a direct threat to Russia, simply in terms of proximity, than the US. The aid commitment in particular sees Europe flexing its economic muscle, and that muscle isn't even being used anywhere near to its full potential. That's worrying for Putin, because he has already pushed Russia as far as it can go financially. And worse yet for Russia's leader, the support of Ukraine isn't a one-way street. This is integration. Ukraine is as valuable a defense partner to NATO as NATO is to Ukraine, especially when it comes to drones. NATO's plan is to ensure that Ukraine wins today so that NATO can present a bigger threat to Russia tomorrow. NATO's members have already pledged to dedicate 5% of their gross domestic product each year to defense spending by 2035. We're seeing defense deals being struck all over Europe, many of which involve Ukraine. Putin wanted to create a divided continent, but all he has done is create a monster that has just thrown its weight behind Ukraine in a way that Russia never saw coming. Russia seems to have been caught by surprise after the Ankara summit. It shouldn't have been. Rumors about NATO's plans have been swirling weeks before, and we covered them. In our video, we explained how NATO's $80 billion pledge would exceed all that Ukraine has asked for, and why it was important that the money comes sooner rather than later. If you want to find out more, stop what you're doing and dig even deeper into why what NATO is doing for Ukraine matters by watching that video. And if you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe to make sure you see more of the military show and our analysis of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.